Friendship improves happiness and abates misery by the doubling of our joy and the dividing of our grief. Marcus Tullius Cicero. Welcome to Module 3, Week 10, Understanding and Allowing Grief. We're going to take a moment now to light our candles. Hopefully viscerally starting to feel that there is a container to hold this grief that we're going to be now talking about and then tapping into. So today we'll do a tuning in. Richard, you're going to do a tuning in today? Yeah? Okay. And then we'll do a check-in, and then we'll go through today's material, and we'll start and continue and end with love. So, Richard, would you tune us in, please?
Certainly, folks. Okay, so as a start, folks, let's make our bodies comfortable. As the soul will respond, as the viscera is at ease. Yeah. Let's just settle down now. Settle down, close the eyes. That's it. Just surrender into your body. Our egoic selves that we need. The chatter of the mind. The to-do list. All things that we need to do in order to survive. That's what the ego is really useful for. Makes a great servant, but a shitty master. So let's just come back to that. Yeah. And this practice here is coming back into the wisdom of the body. Places ourselves, that I, that emotionally conditioned self in service of now. With all its scars, and all its hurts, and all its joys. With all its memories. I am self. Self am I. The self is your body. Unified and whole. Yourself is every emotion that you have experienced and that you are capable of experiencing. Yourself is your mind, your thoughts, all the thoughts you've ever had, you've ever experienced, and all those you will come to know. Yourself, all the images you have experienced within and without, and you are more than all of those. Just come back to the breath. Whenever you are distracted by those thoughts, emotions, physical sensations, images, maybe even intuitions creeping in there. muscling in to that center of awareness and will. Old hurts, traumas, pain may also be making themselves known, and that's okay. Because we are more than all of that. Return to that breath. And before we come back into the room together, I'd like to ask each of you to say a simple thanks, just a simple gratitude for being here in this body, in this company. So just come back to the breath now. In your own good time, open your eyes, have a little smile.
Thank you, Richard.
You're welcome. Welcome, brother.
So I'm going to stop the share and stop the recording. And I invite people, if you're not already, to stand up and breathe and stretch. Breathe those arms up over your head. Exhale your shoulders down. Inhale your ribs wide. Exhale and hum and continue as we move into today's material, understanding and allowing grief. So we've already talked about how we experience losses in different ways: small, large, one-off, cumulative, individual, communal. And that all of these losses, every single one of them, wants to be acknowledged, wants to be grieved. So there are many reasons to grieve. It is natural to experience an array of emotions in response to stress, trauma, and loss. And we call that array of emotions grief. As we experience this array of emotions, we say we are grieving. Subantu Somé said, "I believe the future of our world depends greatly on the manner in which we handle our grief." So in Australia, it took about a decade for Parliament to go back and forth with this idea of a national apology to the Aboriginal people. The stolen generations is what they call them. And then there was a report called Bringing Them Home, which finally was so powerful that the then Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd, emphatically said to the Parliament, "We are going to do this apology." And they crafted this apology, and Kevin Rudd read it on February 13th of 2008 to the nation of Australia. And it's a very, very powerful speech. I would love to read the whole thing, but I'm not going to. I'm going to read a little blurb and encourage you, strongly encourage you to come back and read this whole thing. That today we honor the indigenous peoples of this land, the oldest continuing cultures in human history. We reflect on their past mistreatment. We reflect in particular on the mistreatment of those who were stolen generations, this blemished chapter in our nation's history. The time has now come for the nation to turn a new page in Australia's history by righting the wrongs of the past, and so moving forward with confidence to the future. We apologize for the laws and policies of successive parliaments and governments that have inflicted profound grief, suffering, and loss on these, our fellow Australians. We apologize especially for the removal of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families, their communities, and their country. Now, as I said, this is a much longer speech, and it's very, very powerful. In fact, it's so powerful that only 4 months later, the Prime Minister of Canada, then Stephen Harper, and the government of Canada crafted their own apology, and I'll read just a little bit of that. For more than a century, Indian residential schools separated over 150,000 Aboriginal children from their families and communities. To the approximately 80,000 living former students and all family members and communities, the Government of Canada now recognizes that it was wrong to forcibly remove children from their homes, and we apologize for having done this. We now recognize that it was wrong to separate children from rich and vibrant cultures and traditions, that it created a void in many lives and communities, and we apologize for having done this. We now recognize that in separating children from their families, we undermined the ability for many to adequately parent their own children, and sowed the seeds for generations to follow, and we apologize for having done this. We now recognize that far too often these institutions gave rise to abuse or neglect and were inadequately controlled, and we apologize for failing to protect you. Not only did you suffer these abuses as children, but as you became parents, you were powerless to protect your own children from suffering the same experience. And for this, we are sorry. The apology goes on, and I suggest if you haven't seen it, on Netflix, there's a film called Indian Horse. It is a very painful and wonderful depiction of one person's story in the residential schools in Canada, Indian Horse. So now I am going to speak to, I'm a citizen of the United States of America, and I want to speak to how I feel like my country is so far behind that these apologies were just a drop in the ocean. There's not a whole lot of restitution that's come from these apologies. There's so much more that needs, so much movement that needs to happen to really make up for the atrocities that we people have done to each other and to groups for generations. And in the United States, I feel like we're even behind because we haven't given that powerful of an apology to the whole country, with the whole country listening. President Barack Obama signed off on the Native American Apology Resolution as part of a defense appropriations spending bill passed in 2008, 2009, but again, it wasn't made public, it wasn't enough, and it's still not enough. And Richard, I think you wanted to speak a little bit to your country, the UK, right?
Yeah, just briefly there, Amy. I think what tends to be avoided, perhaps just not spoken of, are the part that other nations in Europe, across Europe, have played in the creation of the United States and how it evolved and how it's come to be the nation it is today, with all of its pros and cons. And just speaking, I'm a citizen of the United Kingdom, of Britain. That's just definitely null and great. And my ancestors played a significant role in the way that the United States was formed, and to be frank, the atrocities and land grabs that took place before your nation was even created, before it was even birthed. So that, I don't think that's something that's much on the, if at all, on the British collective consciousness. There are individuals like, I'd recommend actually one that you read, a gentleman called Akala. I've actually put him on the reading list that Ali sent out. I recommend that you listen to him rather than read. It will be a different experience if you actually listen to the book that he published, a couple of books in fact, on the history of racism, but the history of people other than whites in the United Kingdom, and it's quite instructive. It's something that's definitely raising to awareness, but it's got a long way to go. And of course, and there's just no conversation as to the part that the European nations played in the development of your nation. It's the practices. I mean, just very briefly, Amy. It's quite ironic in a sense that one of the key nations, the nations that played a key role in the establishment of slavery and the general laws of the United States, is the United Kingdom, and it was also the first nation to actually outlaw slavery. Now there are different. I don't think it was all necessarily out of the goodness of their hearts. I'm just quite skeptical about that. But it's of all places that it started. It was in Britain. That basically brought about the ending of slavery. It's quite a conflicting set of emotions on that. So you think that it's the United Kingdom brought about the East India Company, and all the horrors that it brought across the world, including the United States. So yeah, something to reflect on.
Thank you, Richard. It's good to have that that view that there are so many places that need to do so much more work. So many places in the world. Everybody, we all need to do more work. So thank you for that perspective. So grieving is helpful on so many levels. One is grieving can move us to action. When we hear these things, when we have an experience that moves us to action, it's a testament to grief and the power of grief and how it is helpful in moving us forward, moving us into a place where we want to get to and need to get to. So one example of this is MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Drivers. Mothers Against Drunk Drivers was started by a mother whose child was killed by a drunk driver. And it became an organization. She fought for it to this grief became a power to move her forward. And it became an organization that helped to change the laws about drunk driving that weren't there before. Mothers of the Movement. So it started out with 5 mothers of black-skinned, bodied African-American children who have been killed, mostly by police or wrongfully arrested and killed in jail. So Sabrina Fulton is the mom of Trayvon Martin. Geneva Reed Vale is the mom of Sandra Bland. Gwen Carr, Eric Gardner. Kadiatou Diallo, son is Amadou Diallo, and Valerie Bell's child is Sean Bell. So these women, these moms, speak out against police racism, gun violence, criminal justice reform. And, one reason they're doing what they're doing is a great quote here by Gwen Carr, who is the mother of Eric Garner. Eric Garner is the person that we all know who said, I can't breathe. So Gwen Carr said, I know it's too late for Eric, but we have to try and save the unborn. I had to change my mourning into a movement, my pain into purpose. and sorrow into a strategy. I also want to speak to railroad crossings, that railroad crossing signs, those arms that come down and the blinking lights, that those aren't everywhere, and they're especially not in rural areas. There's hardly any signage in rural areas by railroad tracks, and one by one, as a mom has lost her child to a train, she has fought to get a bill passed and to get proper signage at their railroad tracks. And this is still going on today. There are still court cases in rural areas where mostly moms are working to get the proper signage around the railroad tracks. So grief is powerful, powerful, powerful for creating action, moving us to create action. To grieve is to be authentic to your reactions and to live a life fully embraced. Grieving helps dissipate what is held in the body, the stress and the trauma and the loss. And grieving is a means to open one's heart to compassion. As Rumi has said, grief can be the garden of compassion. If you keep your heart open through everything, your pain can become your greatest ally in your life's search for love and wisdom. Now I want to take a moment to come back to our psyche egg diagram and how we have this portal called the dark night of the soul, and how our whole planet has been in a dark night of the soul with this pandemic and with this realization of environmental crises, the realization of racial injustice, all these things that are coming up during this period of time. We are in the dark night of the soul, and it's moving us to action. And hopefully it's kicking us into gear, that we have to have, what do you call it, Richard? The great unraveling before we have the great turning. So often grief and the portal, the dark night of the soul, as we move through this, it brings us through in tears. Washington Irving said, "There is a sacredness in tears. They are not a mark of weakness, but of power. They speak more eloquently than 10,000 tongues. They are the messengers of overwhelming grief, of deep contrition, and of unspeakable love." And in the Little Prince, my favorite little Bible, the quote, "It is such a silent place, the land of tears." I like to reframe that as, it is such a sacred place, the land of tears. Which brings me to this. What does that mean? Sacred means something different to all of us. I think we all have different ideas of what sacred means. So what I'd like to do right now is just unmute and tell me, I'll do my best to write down what you're saying. Tell me what it is you feel like sacred is.
The first word that comes to mind for me is reverence, like having reverence for something.
Love for one another.
Transcendence.
Hope I spelled that correctly.
Full-bodied with a hyphen. Or full body, I guess, would be better.
Sense of peace.
fulfillment.
Of like an example of like all of nature, like including us.
An unfolding of wholeness. An unfolding, Amy.
Important and valuable.
Sanctification.
Commitment.
Is that one M or?
It's two M's there. Two M's, Anna.
One T.
And one T.
Too late. Sorry,
Yep.
my spelling.
Another thing that came up for me was a deep knowing.
Compassion. Empathy.
Brevity.
I want to say pain. Sacred is pain. Like pain is sacred. Yeah.
Suffering. It's out of the bag of life.
Beauty.
Imperfections.
Interdependence.
ENCE. Whoops.
Oh well, too late. It's just spelling. This is just for us.
Love.
Acceptance.
So I think we're starting to get a feel for that sacred has a wide scope, and that the perspective that we each have probably comes from the situation also of what sacred means to us. So there's a spectrum of grief. There are many layers of things that we're grieving. Grieving looks different for each person. Each person grieves different losses differently. Grief becomes more complex with cumulative stress, trauma, and losses. Multiple stress, trauma, and loss alchemizes grief, so it can feel different than the individual reactions combined. And some losses create more complicated grief. Grief is complicated. Some losses trump others. Not to say that one loss is more than another, but they do trump each other. Like, for instance, if somebody has a loss, a personal loss, like they've lost their cat, and someone else just lost their whole village to a tsunami and they're the only survivor, that kind of trumps the other loss. It's not that the losing the cat is not a loss to be grieved. It's just knowing that there is a level of one does trump the other. Also, if someone, loses a precious item in a fire, or loses their people in the fire, that's a different kind of loss. Not to say that we don't grieve both of them, just one is different. If someone loses a person to suicide, that is a very different and complicated grief than when someone loses someone to some other reason, because suicide brings a lot of guilt usually with it. So just a little bit, to be aware of. There's also secondary losses. So in this particular example, I'm going to say that someone loses their spouse. So they're grieving the loss of their spouse. They're also grieving the loss of identity as a spouse, and the loss of income, loss of support system, loss of financial security, loss of confidence, loss of their dreams of the future, and sometimes loss of faith. So hidden grief happens when there's a desire to fit into society and the culture that doesn't know how to grieve and doesn't accept grieving. And in hidden grief, we are trying to manage our cultural expectations, our internal and external cultural expectations. And then we have to sort of weigh out our authenticity or our hiding, our congruency versus our incongruencies. So maybe I'm feeling one way inside, but on the outside putting another face.
Yes, I had an experience a number of years ago where I went years without shedding a tear. And this was striking for me because I've tended to be pretty free with my emotions. I tend to be an emotional being and more than willing to cry when needed. But I went this for years. I didn't cry at all, and it's not that I was aware of it all the time, but every now and again I'd think, "Wow, I haven't had a good cry lately. I wonder what's up with that." But then along the way, something striking started to happen. Every now and again, I would wake up in the middle of the night just weeping uncontrollably. I don't know. I can't really recall what sort of dreams I was having, but clearly there was some sort of an inspiration for this, and what I sort of chalked it up to was, even if I can't do it while I'm conscious, while I'm awake in my waking state, my body knows it needs to release. It has something to let go of, and my body is just going to trick me into do it, whether I'm capable of it while awake or not. So having a good cry, oh my goodness, so valuable. It's so important. So that's just my testimony for the value of being free with those sort of emotions, whatever they happen to be and wherever they come from.
Thank you, Jonas. And Richard, would you speak to this slide, please?
Sure. Yeah, so fear and anger, well, they're both bedfellows in my experience, personal experience, and in working with others for their own fear and anger. And that point at the bottom there, folks, that excavating grief is shadow work. Now that's, I know from my own experience, just sharing a personal journey here briefly. Coming up to when I finished my master's degree and I was getting ready to get back into the world of work in IT, my new profession, and I was just echoing Jonas's experiences of grief, I found myself overwhelmed with rage. Yes. And on closer inspection, I actually discovered that it was grief. It was grief for the loss of a friend. It was grief for the loss of a potential future. It was grief for the loss of my physicality that I value deeply. And the shadow work that actually opened the gate for me to progress with my life was to actually go back and reclimb the mountain and go back. I had to stand in the same place that we fell from. Now, that's not everybody's bag. It's not everybody's route, but it was mine, and I owned it. And so I understand the interplay of emotions when it comes to grief. That range, that spectrum of emotions, that they're intertangled, they're not bound up with each other. And so, from me to you folks, grief is not, well, just echoing again Jonas's point, is it's a kind of a bucket. It's kind of an undifferentiated bucket of stuff, of emotional and visceral stuff that we need to become familiar with and engage and become intimate with. Otherwise, grief becomes an enemy. Rather than an ally.
Thank you, Richard, for sharing. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross talked about the stages or phases of grief, and people started thinking that it meant if you accept the loss, you've mastered denial. If you cry, you're done being sad. If you move through the stages of grief one at a time, you get to acceptance, and then you're done grieving. But that's not what she meant. That's not how it is. Grief is not a linear process with an endpoint. Grief is circular. During initial grieving, there tends to be one or two feelings that dominate the rest, and then other feelings are added in. The aspects of grief circle around, they pop in, they pop out of focus, they often overlap and layer. And eventually, there is more integration of all these aspects of grief with our life. That's the hope, that's the goal, that's what usually happens. And I like to use analogies to describe grief. I've heard a lot of analogies. I've come up with analogies. I can relate to analogies. So here are some of the analogies that I know about. Grief can feel like a wave. I call them grief waves. There can be a feeling of impending doom or angst that lasts for seconds or minutes or weeks or months. That feels like it's behind you and it's coming from somewhere, some unknown place, and we don't know what it is until suddenly there's this feeling that crests, and it's usually an outburst of tears or anger, and it crashes over you and through you like a wave. And you realize, wow, I just was taken over by a grief wave. And then it recedes. Initially, grief waves can feel fast and furious. And in time, sometimes years later, they tend to come and go with a lot less frequency and ferocity. Grief is like the undertow of the ocean. When caught in the undertow, it's best not to fight it. Swim wide, further out into the ocean, and eventually you'll be washed up onto shore. You may be scraped and bruised, but you'll have survived. And grief is very much like this. If we allow ourselves to be taken deeper, usually We become embodied in sacred territory. And then when we're washed up out of that grief wave or up out of that grief, out of that sacred territory, we look back and it's a testament to our resilience. Grief is like a weather pattern. Rain falls, puddles form, puddles evaporate, moisture gathers, clouds form, rain falls. Sometimes the rain falls like a soft rain, sometimes it's a tsunami. And grief is very much like this. There are thoughts and emotions that could include feeling numb, disbelief, being sad, angry, guilty, relieved, accepting, and more. And these take turns, rising and falling, up and in, out of focus, coming to the surface and retreating over and over, again and again. And then there are breaks where the sun is shining and you aren't thinking about the loss. You're just living. Like the weather, grief will continue throughout life. It won't stop. And the pattern of grief will change. Often, after a big grief, big reason for grieving, after a while, the weather pattern becomes calmer for longer periods of time. Grief can be dramatic. Grief is dynamic. Grief can never be stagnant. You can't get stuck in one aspect of grief. People often say, if I cry, I'll never stop, but I assure people that this can't possibly happen. It will not happen. You may cry long and hard. You may cry often. You may cry every morning and every night and in between, but you will not get stuck in being sad and crying. There will be other feelings that come in and out of this, and it will change. Grief is fluid. Grief can be relentless. Franz Schubert said, "Every night when I go to bed, I hope that I may never wake again, and every morning renews my grief." Grief can be like a beast that has its way with you. Grief can be a surprise like a Mack truck coming down a street that you just didn't see and crushes you. Grief can be like a black hole, sucking all of the meaning and motivation and color out of life. And this is my favorite analogy. Grief can be like a blanket that is tightly woven and covering you. I had this experience of feeling this tightly woven blanket of grief covering me, and I knew that I was in there, but I had no access to me, the person, the personality. And the personality had no access to life. It was just this heavy, tightly woven blanket of grief that I wore. And eventually the fibers loosened up and there was more access to me and I had more access to life. And then eventually the blanket became threadbare and I carry this blanket of grief and I have a lot more access to me and my life while I carry this blanket of grief. Brian Stevenson said, "There is a strength, a power even, in understanding brokenness, because embracing our brokenness creates a need and desire for mercy, and perhaps a corresponding need to show mercy. When you experience mercy, you learn things that are hard to learn otherwise. You see things you can't otherwise see, you hear things you can't otherwise hear. You begin to recognize the humanity that resides in each of us." So check in right now. What are you feeling in your body? What grief is coming up? Where does it live in your body? What does it feel like? Can you feel restriction, opening, deepening? Does it feel like you want to run away or fight, or are you frozen? Does it feel like you can make it through this? What we call clean pain. Can you let yourself feel that clean pain? Can you place your grief in this container that we've created and allow it to be? Allow yourself whatever the grief is that might be rising. Use your self-care and your settling, your knowledge of clean pain right now. Self-massage, breathing, humming. You can get up and do qigong, shaking, lengthening, widening, undoing. Bringing yourself into this present moment. Reframing something. Naming emotions if that helps. Whimper crying if you want to move an emotion that feels like it's wanting to be expressed, but it's a little stuck. If you feel trauma coming up, release and replace. You could rock back and forth, wobble your head. Use our method of breathe, ground, and resource. Finding a place or a person or a pet that makes us feel safe. Bringing them into our space, into our emotional, psychic space. And completing an action. If you feel something coming up that feels like I never got to really complete this, maybe it's emotion or a completing the action if possible. You may want to journal things that come up for you as we speak. And it might be just grief. Allow grief in its container, in this container, this big container that we've created. If it's grief, just allowing grief is enough. So stand up, breathe, stretch, do what you need to do right now. So I think that grief is ongoing. I think that grief takes longer than the allotted time that we have off from work. If you agree with this, please raise your hand. I think that grief is a lifetime job. If you agree with this, raise your hand. And I think that grief is wanting to be allowed daily. If you agree with this, raise your hand. Pretty much, I think, all on the same page. So grief exists. It's a simple concept, and yet it's often ignored because our current cultural norm is to suppress emotions and ignore pain. So to normalize grief, to create a new norm, you have to do a paradigm shift toward authenticity and being whole. And I've come up with something that I call a grief mantra or grief meditation. It's kind of like a few weeks back, we did forgiveness meditation, forgiveness mantra, and we talked about a gratitude journal using I am grateful for, I am grateful for. So this is the same kind of thing, but it's with grief. So what we do is we say, I am grieving over and over, or write, I am grieving over and over. And it may be that I am grieving is all that sentence says, or it may be that something else comes after that. I am grieving this. I am grieving this. So I'm going to give us a few minutes to journal, and what I'm going to ask you to do is just write the words, I am grieving. Start a new page. I am grieving. And keep writing that over and over and just see what comes up. Take your time. And again, notice what you're feeling in your body. Notice what that exercise did if you're feeling different than the first time you checked in with your body. how things might have moved, what has come up. Is there more contraction? Is there more spaciousness? Is there a feeling of feeling more settled, more connected to your whole self, to the parts of the self? And again, if needed, please do self-care, settling, follow through any clean pain that you can. And just allow grief. Set it in the container that we've created. Let it breathe and be. So we're going to talk about allowing grief, ways that are helpful to help us to allow grief. Someone once said to me, be gentle with yourself, and I had never heard that. That was a really helpful mantra for me to take on. Be gentle with yourself. You're grieving. Allow all thoughts and emotions to rise and fall as they will for as long as they do. They're all real. They're all acceptable. You are okay as you are. Feel your emotion, and when it changes, let it go. Allow this to happen over and over as the various emotions of grief rise and fall again and again. To support others, be present, listen, and accept whatever comes up, whenever it comes up, as an ongoing process for life. Trust the process. Know that grief never ends, it just changes. Find your unique way of understanding and explaining what's going on for you. And try, if we can, each of us, to accept others and ours different processes. Be curious about the grieving process. Become an observer and student. And for me, and maybe for you, grief will become your sacred teacher. Be curious about why others act as they do. Everyone has their story. Everyone is grieving something. When we observe something we don't understand, maybe we could dig deeper and wonder, what might their grief story be? When we talk to people, talk about the person or the thing or the event that they are experiencing loss from and they're grieving. Use the name if it's a person or a pet. Be real. This part that is gone, this part that has changed, this part that's being grieved, if it's a person or a pet, they were a part of this person's life and they still are. If it's an event and a thing, it was part of this person's life and it still is. State the obvious, like grieving is insanely hard work, or my heart hurts, or I'm feeling ... fill in the blank. Stating our feelings keeps us honest, and it can move a difficult emotion to a less intense setting. Check for unhealthy thinking patterns. If you're telling yourself over and over, I can't do this, I don't want to do this, I don't want to be here, you're building a case towards self-destructive behavior or suicide. Destructive behavior causes more problems that will eventually need attention. At some point, you will feel more ease, joy, and peace. And you don't need another problem to deal with that holds you down when you're ready to fly. Suicide is permanent. The rawness of grief waves, every single grief wave, is temporary. Reframe your mantras. If you find yourself saying, I don't want to be here, reframe it, replace it with something like, this is hard. I want things to change. Eventually things will change. Keep healthy boundaries. Support the bereaved by holding a safe and strong container for them to climb in, grieve fully, climb out, and repeat as needed. Be empathetic. Feel their emotion if you do, and then let it go when you're ready to, because they'll be doing the same thing. If you climb into the container of grief, let it be your own grief that you're feeling, not theirs. Don't take on someone else's. The bereaved feel freer to grieve, knowing that the support system and they are both going to come out feeling healthy. Henri Nouwen said, the friend who can be silent with us in a moment of despair or confusion, who can stay with us in an hour of grief and bereavement, who can tolerate not knowing, not healing, not curing, that is a friend. Seek support and know that you're not alone. Find people who will hold a safe space for you while you grieve. Seek out individuals or a support group with others who've experienced a similar loss, are experiencing a similar level of stress. During the first weeks after a significant loss, try not to be alone longer than the time you'd spend in a bath. I was told this after Michelle died, and it was quite true. It was very difficult to be alone. During these times of COVID, it's even more difficult for people who are going through a significant loss to be alone. So I suggest when someone is going through a significant loss nowadays, to find visual support online like Zoom or on the phone like FaceTime. Try turning up internal voices of supportive friends and internal voices of supportive ancestors. Imagine these supportive voices listening while you grieve, being there with you while you grieve. Ancestors can be very supportive. Victor Hugo said, death has its revelations. The great sorrows which open the heart open the mind as well. Light comes to us with our grief. As for me, I have faith. I believe in a future life. How could I do otherwise? My daughter was a soul. I saw this soul. I touched it. When it comes to death, trust when you hear, see, or sense the deceased. If you can, accept spiritual contact as support. I would suggest, if people haven't heard of this or seen it, that there's a 6-part series on Netflix called Surviving Death. It is phenomenal. I suggest you see it if you haven't. Wendell Berry, I come into the peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. For a time I rest in the grace of the world and am free. Enjoy the breaks. So we're rounding up into adopting a both-and view. Grief waves are tumultuous and they subside. Between the waves there are breaths of pure presence and being fully conscious. Anne Royfay said, grief is in 2 parts. The first is loss. The second is the remaking of life. Life is different when you're grieving, when something is different. and you don't know what it will be like. You may feel frightened and curious. A broken heart is an open heart. The heart is broken, and because it's broken open, love is freely flowing.
There's this beautiful song by John Denver that whenever I hear this quote or this idea, I think about. It's called This Old Guitar. Have any of you ever heard this song, This Old Guitar? Well, there's this brief section where he says something to the effect of, this old guitar taught me how to love, and it opened up your eyes and ears to me. And I guess it broke your heart because it opened up your heart, allowing space for us to be. We need our hearts broken, my friends. May all of our hearts be broken open. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonas. Beautiful. Thank you, John Denver.
I think when we think of the words integration and integrity, I think we really like the word sacred. We need to grasp what these words might mean to us individually. And when I think of the word integrity, it's bound up in a few things. And for me personally, just as from my own perspective, and apply this perhaps for yourselves, is integrity means one intent, I was about to say one direction, and it's not the pop band. It's we're not being pulled in we're not being pulled in different directions. Yeah, we're not being pulled out, and when it comes to being pulled in different directions, folks, it's usually out of fear out of to survive, fear to make the paycheck. Yeah, it's fear to make ends meet, etc., etc. And so with integrity, that comes down to what's important, what we value. Yeah. And what we value, what's important. It comes down to what is sacred. Yeah. I personally I've put a great stock. My personal integrity is being straight as I can. Yeah. Yeah. Playing straight with other people. Yeah. I'll be straight. Don't fuck them around. Don't treat others the way that you wouldn't want to be treated. Yeah. And it's such a central matter to become familiar with and intimate with and apply. Is when we think about integrity and integration. I've come across quite a few therapists and coaches who bound these words around, and really, I just don't get the impression that they actually understand them on a felt, visceral level. Integration means you are going in one direction and you know yourself. You're not compromising your ethics. You're not compromising what you value, what's important, what you find sacred. That's how we integrate ourselves. We find within ourselves a purpose, a mission. Great point to raise here. A person who I have great respect for. He's actually in the call with us. It's Jonas. Just one put as an example. You're giving yourself a purpose, a mission from your grief, from your pain, from your suffering. That requires an intimate familiarity with with our own sense of integrity. You discovered what you stand for. Yeah? And you live in it. That's an example. Same with yourself, Army. Yeah? It's I'm kind of being quite coarse here. It's calling out our own bullshit. It's calling out our own bullshit. So integrity is bound up with shadow work. Yeah. Otherwise, without knowing what's important to us, what we individually find sacred, we can't be whole. So how can we grieve? Yeah. How can we grieve? And that's a frightening place for many people. I've been there myself. So most importantly, integrity is around knowing ourselves sufficiently to allow ourselves to grieve. And that includes calling out our own bullshit. Yeah.
Thank you, Richard. I suggest that you go back and read those full apologies. They are powerful. They hopefully will help move you to action as they do me. Suggest that you do some more with that I am grieving exercise. Maybe journal and share with each other in a smaller group. Maybe it will feel more comfortable to do it that way. And watch Surviving Death if you can. And maybe journal about it and share. And go back to your previous material. Review, continuing to release stress, heal trauma, settle and harmonize with others. Choose clean pain, which is about integrity. And continue to change culture. Maybe review and revise your vision of a realistic ideal future for all. Maybe it's going to include grieving now. It's going to start including how to allow for grief. And choose the step that you can accomplish now and do it.
This is a very old chant. It go in English. It is Holy God, Holy Strength, Holy Immortal, have mercy. Agios, O Theos, Agios, Iskyros, Agios Athanatos, Eleison Imas.
Thank you, Nancy. Why don't we unmute and say every loving thing that you want to each person.
All right.
Nancy,
Brothers and
thank you
sisters,
so much for
thank you.
sharing that with us. That
You
was
are loved and
absolutely
cherished.
beautiful.
Move through. It was really great to journal.
Nancy,
Love
Remy,
you, Remy. Love you,
good
Nancy.
to see
Love
you.
you,
you.
Allie.
Richard,
Love you,
thank you.
Jonas.
Richard, I
Love
love
you,
you.
Richard.
Ali.
You, Avi.
Allie, I love you.
Love you,
Love you, Kat, out
Love
there.
you.
Oh.
I adore you.
It's
And Kat, wherever you are, I love you too.
wherever you are.